Hello and welcome back for round 3 of the Maritime Open. Let's dive right into the game. So I am playing with the black pieces in this round, playing against another reasonably, high-rated player, 1682 in this case, although kind of going into this tournament, I kind of wondered if my rating was 1543, and I kind of wondered if that was just a little bit low, if I was maybe sort of playing in about the 1600s. So this promised to be a pretty good game. So again, playing with the black pieces. White plays e4, and I play the Caro-Kann, and then white plays the Fantasy Variation. And when I saw this, I kind of chuckled to myself because I had recently not done very well in a game against the Fantasy Variation, and so I did a bit of study and I learned sort of a main line. I feel like there are a few different ways to handle the fantasy, but I learned a main line which is pretty sharp and pretty requires precision. So I kind of thought to myself, all right, let's go. Let's give this a try and see if I know how to handle this in an actual tournament game. So the thing with the Fantasy Variation, if you're not aware, this F3 push, on one hand, it takes away the natural developing square for this knight and potentially opens up dark squared weaknesses around the king if the king castles that way. But the idea is it prevents, or seems to prevent, black from capturing on e4, because if black captures, then white captures, and now white just has a really strong center with 2 pawns, and black only has the 1 central pawn. So what's the best way to handle it? Well, there's a few ways to handle it, and what I used to do was kind of go for a fianchetto kind of setup and then try to kind of chip away at the center from there. But the line that I play now is I just take anyway, and I allow white to get that center and then immediately push e5. And this is an interesting move for a number of reasons. Basically, white, almost the only good move for white is to move this knight out, which is what my opponent did. But a lot of other moves for white fail. So if white just goes ahead and takes that pawn, or like in many lines, if white does something other than this knight move, the queen can come and deliver a check. And, if say the king, well, first of all, if white tries to block this way, then white actually loses their rook. And there's, even if white doesn't do that, like, there's not a lot of great options. In fact, the only option here other than pushing the g-pawn would be for the king to move. And so now, of course, this means that white can no longer castle, and their king is out in the open, and their pawn structure is damaged. And yeah, so basically, in this position, white's best option is to play knight f3. There might be another, like, 1 or 2 moves that work, but knight f3 is the main line. And then how I play it is I bring the bishop out to g4, pinning that knight. And then what's pretty typical is white will play something like bishop c4, because there's some tactics around, like, grabbing that pawn, and then when the king recaptures, the knight comes in for a check and wins that bishop. And so you have to be, as black, you have to be really precise. Like, if the bishop goes here, you need to bring this knight defending that pawn. If this happens, then since the rook is also piling up on the f-pawn, you need to move this knight out to kind of put it in the way. And then if this comes out, that means the queen might be lining up, and so a good option is to move the bishop back and defend that pawn. So there's all these ideas that you have to be pretty precise about. But my opponent did not play sort of that critical main line. Instead, they simply played c3, just defending this pawn. So I played knight out anyway, because with c3, it kind of makes them a move closer to potentially lining up the bishop and the queen. So I figured I should at least be prepared for that. They played bishop e3. I decided to develop my knight, and that is also attacking that pawn. They bring out their knight. And then bishop d6. It seems like a bit of a funny place for the bishop, but of course it can't develop out any further. And it, like, potentially if this pawn ever captures here, then this bishop is maybe lined up against the king side. It's unclear which way white is going to castle at this point. Actually, they've been developing out their queen side quite a bit, so maybe they're going to go that way. and in the fantasy variation for black, I can also castle either way. I can bring my queen here or here and castle queenside and be totally fine. In some lines, that's what I would do. White develops their light squared bishop. I bring my queen out to c7. I don't want to commit yet to castling one way or the other, so I brought that out, also lining up for potential tactics here. And now white plays queen c2 as well. I was kind of hoping that white would castle, so I'd kind of know what sort of game we're getting into and which way they're going to go. But with this move, that was fine. And then I'm actually quite proud of what I did here. It's not the best engine move, but I feel like it was a very good move for me. I realized that along with delaying castling for a move and potentially opening up castling this way, one thing that this does is it defends this pawn with the queen, which means that this knight is free to move. And I was kind of looking at this position, not being quite sure what to do yet, and wondering, is there anything that white can do to kind of put pressure on my side of the board? Like to move a piece somewhere that does something on my side of the board that is going to make me kind of uncomfortable. And I found this move, this knight c4 move, and I thought that would actually be kind of annoying. Like it's not the end of the world. It puts some pressure on this pawn, and it potentially looks to trade off a knight for that bishop. And I just decided it was uncomfortable enough to me that I didn't want a knight coming there. And so I thought, okay, well, can I prevent it? Is there a good way for me to prevent it? I could push this b pawn, and maybe that would be okay. But then it feels like this pawn suddenly is pretty weak, and I didn't really want that to happen. And so what I played was knight b6, and I am happy about that and how that went, because for one thing, after this move, my opponent took some time to think. So I think probably he was planning to bring that knight there. I'm not sure, of course, but this knight move prevents that. And I was pretty happy about that. Now he played a4, which I was expecting, thinking probably the plan was a5 to kick the knight away. And then I played a5 to block any further expansion, which worked out perfectly well. But after looking at it in the engine, it turns out that white has a really nice tactic here. And I'm gonna leave it as an exercise if you would like to try to find the tactic. My hints are it has to do with the fact that this knight is no longer defended with a pawn, and so if this bishop gets opened up to capture here, the pawn can't recapture, and that is a pretty important thing. But there's another little trick to it. So leave a comment down below if you can find what the correct follow-up is in this line, what tactic white could have had, which wins material for white and would have probably won them the game. In any case, white castled here. And now there was a tactic that I had been thinking of for a while, and I wasn't sure whether I should castle first or just go for it, but I figured, all right, this tactic wins me a pawn, so I'm going to do it. Now, it's a little bit double-edged because what I'm seeing is this line up here against this h2 pawn. And in order to play this tactic, I need to capture here. And white is probably going to take back with the c pawn, and now white is going to have two central pawns, and I'm going to have none. So that's a little bit of a concession, and I wasn't really happy about that, but I figured winning a pawn was probably good enough. Good enough for that to happen. And so I did that. I captured here, and then I captured this pawn, and it looks like the knight can just take back, but then this bishop is undefended, and so that's why this tactic works. And so that's what I was expecting, was for knight takes and bishop takes, and now this is hitting that rook, and you know, the game would go on from there. But white evidently didn't want to move into any of that, and so they moved the king to h1. And I moved my bishop back because I didn't want anything where like this pawn is coming down and blocking defense of this bishop if it's over here, because then the king can potentially just take it. And so I moved the bishop here, and now my bishops are just a menace. Like they're just hanging out on the king side. They're not doing anything like immediate, but they're limiting some squares that everything can go. They're adding some pressure, and I was pretty happy with those bishops just kind of sitting there for now. So now white starts lining some things up on the queen side, probably going after this knight because there's potentially the discovered attack from the bishop. I decided I should be okay here, and the knight should always have somewhere to go. I didn't see any case where the knight was going to get trapped or I was going to lose that pawn, but it was just something I had to keep an eye on. So I decided to go ahead and castle, and it's clear that white wants to make this push happen because now my c pawn is pinned against the queen, and so that's going to happen. But I still felt like it would be fine. I brought this rook over, and now I'm actually attacking this pawn. And then it started getting, I don't know about chaotic, but they went ahead with this push, and we made some trades here. So first I just moved the knight out of there. We traded a pawn. This does split my pawns, which is not great. Like maybe there's something better I could have done. I guess I should look at that, but I felt like I was okay with this because I felt like I had really good pressure sort of against the center and the king side. Queen c4, adding an attacker to this pawn. Rook c8, rook a c8, adding a defender. And then bishop down. I think, I'm not sure, maybe just to like add some pressure on this knight perhaps, but I felt like giving up this square was pretty beneficial for me. And so I put my bishop there, and that kind of pins this knight and maybe sets up some interesting moves, some interesting tactics. The engine, I think, prefers queen to f4 instead, and I don't think there's much of a difference. I think that this is like the second best move. So I'm pretty happy with being able to find that. So queen d3, and now the queen is defending this pawn, and knight e5, and so I'm offering some trades and kind of messing with things in the center. There's a line here where if how does it go? Like, so they just took the knight, right? There's a line here where if this bishop gets taken and these pieces have cleared off the board, then my knight takes back on this square, and there's a checkmate threat right here. Of course, assuming that this knight has moved as well. Which is kind of interesting. It's just one of those positions where everything is kind of pointing in the right direction, so there are potential tactics and complications that my opponent has to deal with. So we traded off the knights, traded and put my knight here, which is what I was going for, and now I'm threatening to capture here with a checkmate threat. And so white put the queen here, and I simply continued the trades and grabbed this pawn. So now I'm up 2 pawns. I have a bishop against a knight, and my pawn structure isn't amazing, but neither is theirs. It's actually worse. And so I felt like this should be an absolutely winning endgame for black. So black attacked my bishop. I moved back to a3 to prevent the rooks from doubling up. Attacked my bishop again, and again I moved it somewhere to prevent the rooks from doubling up because I didn't want the rooks to double up against this pawn if I could possibly prevent it. Knight c4, I decided to bring my rook into play, maybe start to finally use this h-file that I had opened up against the king, and then doubled up the rooks, and white played e5. So white was going into kind of this defensive position with the pawns. Given that the pawns are separated and can't defend each other, they were putting them all, white was putting the pawns on squares that were easily defendable. Like this knight is defending, and the knight is quite hard to get rid of, for example. And then this pawn, like even the king could come and defend it if needed. So it was a bit tough to know what to do at this point, honestly. But I felt like I'm up material. Let's try to simplify as much as I possibly can. Like anywhere I can find ways to trade things off, let's do it. And so first of all, I chased the queen around just a little bit. brought in my own queen. There's a little bit of a threat here. Like I need to make sure that my queen or something continues guarding this f-pawn. And then rook h2. I brought my rook over to f8, which didn't feel fantastic, but again, needing to hold on to this f-pawn. And I wanted to kind of bring my queen in so I could offer a queen trade. I felt like getting the queens off the board would be in my favor. So rook moved over and I brought the queen finally. And I saw that probably what they were going to do was this move. So we are still going to trade queens. I guess I could choose not to trade queens, but I decided to go for it. But as compensation for white, they were able to fix their pawn structure. But I'm still up 2 pawns, and so this is still better for black. Now this move was actually a bit of a mistake. I didn't label it, but let me label it right here. So this was actually a bit of a mistake. I was just looking at like, this is a mate threat that now they have to deal with, but it is kind of just a 1-move threat. They have a million ways they can get out of that mate threat. And the other thing it does, like they moved their rook down here, and now there's a discovered attack on this bishop, and it is no longer defended by a pawn like it was up here. The best move, what was the best move here? It was to play rook g4 instead. And so now I'm threatening this pawn, and white is going to have to do something in order to defend it, because they can't push it, they'll lose their knight. But I played here, they moved their rook down. Then I found rook g4, sort of 1 move too late. Not that it's too late; it's still a strong move, but it would have been stronger than moving this bishop down. And then I think probably my opponent was starting to get tired because they pushed this pawn, which is just completely losing a knight. And I think this was just like, the game had been going on for a few hours at this point, and was it the second round? No, this was not the second round of the day. It was the first round. So that wasn't part of the issue. But obviously they were just seeing too many complications. They were already down material. They were sort of trying desperately to do something, probably to push these pawns and cause some problems on the king side, and just completely dropped a knight. And to their credit, they didn't resign at this point. They kept going, and they had some pretty nice looking counterplay over here. I pushed this pawn to avoid losing a pawn there, but then they pushed their f pawn, and things like I had to calculate pretty carefully here, because like if I just do something like pushing here, then they're just going to take, and now I'm the one getting checkmated, right? So it was a little bit tricky. But what I found was this move, rook to d8, which I'm pretty happy with. The kingside attack is pretty strong, but there are no checks right away. And I figured if I can get my rooks onto these 2 ranks, I can start delivering checks and force a trade of 1 pair of rooks. And once one of white's rooks is off the board, their attack is much, much weaker. There's not nearly as much as they can do. And that's what happened. So they moved over here, kind of threatening this, I suppose. But then I delivered a check, delivered another check, and we traded rooks. And then as a little bonus, my bishop is defending that square. So I got to put my rook here, and now I'm holding onto that square as well. I offered a rook trade. They declined. I grabbed a pawn. And the rest of the game is pretty it's pretty quick and easy. I just activated my king a bit, offered another rook trade. Of course, they're kind of putting pressure on this bishop, but my rook is just always defending. So I push a pawn again, and I think maybe they want to come down and infiltrate somehow. They can't go there because of the bishop, so maybe there, try to like wrap around and try to put some pressure on these pawns. But I delivered a check, I delivered another check, and I figured if they go here to try to blockade this pawn, then I can just deliver another check and force a rook trade, and then things are looking really good for me. I have 3 passed pawns actually, and the game is pretty much over. And this is where white resigned. There's not much more to be done other than maybe to move their king back, but there's not much that they'll be able to do. And then I suppose even if they move their king back, I can just put my rook there and prevent this rook from ever infiltrating, and yeah, things are not looking good. So yeah, it was a good game. Not like, certainly not perfectly played by me, but I felt like I played pretty well. And again, against sort of a higher rated opponent, I felt like I kept my cool and kept my nerves and managed to play quite strongly. And so that was round 3. At this point, I have 2 wins and 1 draw for the first half of the tournament. So I'm feeling pretty good. And stay tuned for the rest of the games coming up. There are some pretty good ones. And so round 4 will be coming soon. And I'll see you then.